This is the story of Alitalia Flight 404. On the 14th of November 1990, Flight 404 was a flight from Linate Airport in Milan to Zurich. They were flying a DC-9 and they had 40 passengers and 6 crew members on board. At 6:36 p.m., Alitalia Flight 404 took off from runway 36 right from Linate, bound for Zurich, with the first officer at the controls. The DC-9 left Italy behind and climbed to its cruising altitude of 20,000 feet. As they reached their cruising altitude, they listened to the automated weather broadcasts from Zurich. The surface wind at Zurich was at 240 degrees and 8 knots. The pilots discussed among themselves about the best possible runway for a landing. The first officer is of the opinion that landing on runway 28 would be the best, given the current wind conditions, but the active runway right now is runway 14, but they still discuss a left-hand circling approach to land on runway 28. As they descended, they talked about the approach procedure for runway 14. They also talked about what they should do in the event of a communications failure or a go-around. The crew were given radar vectors to perform an ILS approach onto runway 14. At 7 p.m., the co-pilot says, "We perform a Cat 2 approach." As all of this happened, they descended through 9,000 feet and passed a beam of Zurich Airport. They were to the southwest of the airport. The captain noted, "We are by Cloten, flight level 90. He is bringing us in high." From the radar plots in the report, that puts them approximately here. So, let's see the approach that they were trying to execute. From the point that they were at, they'd fly to Ekron or near it and then turn right to a heading of 070 degrees. They'd maintain 070 degrees till they reached D10. Then they'd turn right to the runway heading, all the while maintaining 4,000 feet till they intercepted the glide slope at DME 8. From then, it's just a matter of following the ILS glide slope to the foot of the runway and then landing on runway 14. Now that we know what they were planning to do, let's get back to the cockpit to see how they executed this approach. After the captain commented that they were abeam of Zurich, they were cleared to descend to 6,000 feet and they were asked to fly 325 degrees. With a heading of 325, they'd arrive at or near Ekron. Once near Ekron, they set the heading to 068 degrees, which took the plane in a right turn. And they were following the approach chart correctly up to this point. At 7:05 p.m., they identified ILS runway 14. At 7:06 p.m., they got the approach clearance to the ILS runway 14. As we talked about before, they had to maintain 4,000 feet to intercept the extended center line of the runway. To do this, they were given a heading of 110 degrees and to maintain 4,000 feet. This took the plane in another right turn, but the captain read the heading back as 120 degrees. This caused a bit of confusion for the first officer. Should he fly 110 degrees or 120 degrees? The first officer selected 110 degrees and they flew on. Soon afterward, the co-pilot said, "Radio approach." They were about to intercept the localizer. They were about to make their final course correction to line up with the runway. The co-pilot set Radio 1 as the receiver for this landing. At this point, they had made their final turn to line up with the runway, but they were slightly east of the localizer. That's the little curve that you see here on the radar plot. That's them straying a bit to the east. They set the flaps to 15 for landing. After that, the captain said that they had captured the glide path. He also noted that they were a bit east of the localizer. 5 seconds later, they heard an altitude exit alert. The captain silenced the warning. The captain asked the first officer to slow down a bit to keep separation with a Finnair aircraft ahead of them. They set the flaps to 25 degrees and discussed the possibility of icing. The airplane was established on the localizer and they descended through 3,000 feet. Even though they were lined up with the runway, the pilots did not know that they were 1,300 feet below the glide slope. They had been below the glide slope since the start of their descent, but they still hadn't realized that fact. As they got closer to the airport, confusion in the cockpit brews. The co-pilot is asking his captain if they've passed the outer marker for runway 14. They're at about 670 feet off the ground, and they were supposed to be at the outer marker when they were at 1,250 feet. They were 6.2 nautical miles from the runway, and at about 600 feet off the ground, the captain sensed that something was wrong. The position of the outer marker just does not make sense to him. He says, "That doesn't make sense to me." The co-pilot responds with, "Nor to me." He says, "Pull, pull, pull." On the CVR, the sound of the autopilot disconnecting could be heard. The co-pilot calls, "Go around." The co-pilot ramps up the engines and pulls the nose up. He arrested their descent from 1100 feet per minute to 190 feet per minute. The captain says, "No, no, 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 no. Catch the glide." After 11 seconds, the captain asks the first officer, "Can you hold it?" The co-pilot replied with, "Yes." Right after he said that, the radar altimeter in the cockpit starts beeping, letting them know that they were dangerously low. The captain says, "Hold on, let's try to." The captain never got to finish his sentence. At 7:11 p.m., the plane struck the northern slope of the Stradlerberg Mountain, killing all 46 people on board. The plane had crashed into the Stradlerberg Mountain. It had no lights on it, and in the pitch black of night, there was no way that they could have seen it. There had been talks about placing lights on the mountain. These talks dated back to 1976, but after the loss of Alitalia 404, they added lights to the mountain. The investigators pore over the wreck to see what could have brought the plane down. They see no telltale signs of an in-flight explosion. The engines were working fine at the time of the impact. Digging through the wreckage, they find something interesting. They find the captain's HSI, or the horizontal situation indicator. They examine the HSI under a microscope. They find that at the time of the impact, the HSI showed that the plane was above the on-glide position. So the captain's HSI was telling him that the plane was more or less on the glide slope. But listening to the CVR, the investigators found out that the plane intercepted the glide slope when it was 1,300 feet below the glide slope. The plane was nowhere near where the captain thought it was. The plane was in nav mode. What this means is that the autopilot will follow a VOR, a radial, or a localizer. The nav receivers picked up radio signals and then passed it on to the autopilot. During the final approach, all 4 nav instruments in the cockpit were switched to nav receiver 1. They examined the device. It was damaged too badly in the crash. But the investigators dig up a letter from McDonnell Douglas, the manufacturer of the airplane. It was dated the 24th of August 1984. The letter talks about how instruments in the cockpit can show a false localizer or a false glide slope indication when the plane is nowhere near those conditions. This is due to the nav receiver not delivering an output signal due to a short circuit. Airplanes like the DC-9, the DC-8, and the MD-80 were affected. Unfortunately, the nav receiver on the accident airplane was prone to this failure. But did the pilots and the airline know about this? In 1985, McDonnell Douglas held a seminar to inform airlines about this issue. Alitalia was represented by 3 captains, but the issue due to the nav receivers were never made known to the pilots of Alitalia. That information never trickled down. But that on its own does not explain the accident. They were low on approach and their instruments were telling them that they were right on the glide slope. But they should have been able to figure out that they were well below their glide slope. On this approach, they were supposed to be at 1,200 feet by the outer marker, but during the landing, the pilots should have been able to see that they were well below 1,200 feet before hitting the outer marker. In fact, we hear this confusion play out in the cockpit. When checking the position of the outer marker, the captain says that it does not make sense to him. He was so close to figuring it out, but something stopped him from making that connection that might have saved them all. The investigators look for something that may have confused the pilots. They zero in on the altimeters. The altimeters in use were the drum pointer type. The drum pointer type altimeter was notorious for being hard to read. To read a drum type altimeter, there were 2 steps. You first had to look at the drum to see the thousandths part of your altitude, and then you had to look at the needle to figure out the hundredths part. When the drum is partially covered by the needle, you can misread the altitude very easily. In fact, NASA studies have found that a pilot needs multiple glances to read the altitude on a drum-type altimeter. Other studies have also proven how easy it is to misread the altimeter. Here are the main 2 takeaways of those 2 studies. Misreads happen often at lower altitudes when there is a lot of activity happening, and it is easy to misread the altimeter by 1,000 feet when the drum is between values. This makes sense as to why the captain didn't initiate a go-around, as he likely misread the altitude to an altitude above 1,000 feet. So now his instruments are telling him that they're on the correct glide slope, and he mistakenly thinks that they're too high. Unknown to him, there's a big mountain with no lights on it ahead of them. This is a recipe for disaster. This is when the GPWS system should kick in. The pilots would realize that they're in danger, and then they'd save the plane. The Mode 5 of the GPWS system should have given the crew a below glide slope warning, and Mode 2B should have given them a terrain warning. For Mode 2B to produce a terrain warning, the closure rate needs to be above 4,000 feet per minute. And Mode 5 warning was never fired because as far as the plane was concerned, they're on the glide slope due to the faulty nav receiver. Their last line of defense is the co-pilot. He knows that something is wrong. He sees that they're too low, and he realizes that the outer marker is still ahead of them. He asks the captain. The captain says that the outer marker is still ahead of them, and he makes the connection. They're too low. If they haven't passed the outer marker, they should not be this low. He initiates a go-around. This is when the captain said, "No, no, 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 catch the glide." He still thinks that they're higher than they are, and he's of the opinion that if they maintain their altitude, they'd be back on the glide slope pretty soon. He doesn't even change his mind when the radio altimeter went off. I'm sure you all must be wondering, would the plane have made it had the co-pilot continued the go-around? Yes, the plane would have cleared the mountain. But why was the captain so averse to a go-around? As the old adage goes, you can always go around. A go-around is usually associated with a lot of paperwork, and the report states that pilots saw go-around as a lack of competence and as a failure. But as per Alitalia rules, the crews do not have to justify their actions as far as go-arounds are concerned. Broken instruments, a misread altimeter, and a captain who just did not see the danger in front of him doomed 46 people. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It'll really help the channel grow. I'll catch you guys next time.